This happened about 10 to 12 years ago in northeast Germany. It was a weekend and I had some friends over. At around 1 a.m, one of my female friends wanted to go home. We lived in a small town, maybe 60 to 70,000 people, in different parts of the town. I lived in the east city and she lived in the south. There was a small gap of forest between both parts. She had to walk about 3 to 4 kilometers home, so I decided I would bring her home, because, well, we were about 18 years old, and she was, and still is, very attractive, and I know there are a lot of, well, terrible people out there in the world. One of my buddies decided to join us too. She didn't like the forest, so we walked a long way through the downtown, and, well, we brought her home and said goodbye and just went back. We didn't want to take the long way again though, so me and my buddy decided to take the shortcut through the small forest. The path to the forest had a few streetlights, but about halfway before you reach the forest, the light just ends. In other words, it was pitch black, like extremely dark. We didn't notice this earlier. We just realized it when we suddenly were almost in absolute darkness. We could only see about 1 or 2 meters in front of us, and that's it. But, well, we didn't think too much about it and just continued on our way back. Our mood was still good because the day and evening and night were great so far, and some friends were still waiting and partying at my place. Plus, we didn't get scared that easily. We were almost at the forest, maybe 500 meters away, when we just suddenly hear a scream, like nothing we've heard before, and nothing we've ever heard again after this day. Honestly, it sounded like someone taught us Circulus or how to sing in a death metal band or something. It was high-pitched and welded together, a deep growl. It didn't sound human completely, but it still also sounded human, kind of. It was loud, but relatively far away, and we just froze immediately. We didn't move, and we didn't say anything, and just sat there, listening. The scream was at least 100 to 200 meters away from what we could tell. It was still pitch black where we were, and we couldn't see anything further away than 1 or 2 meters. We just looked at each other, dead in silence, unsure how to move ahead. But a few seconds later, there was the exact same scream, just way louder. It was like the source of the sound moved from 100 to 200 meters distance to 5 meters in a matter of seconds. Well, we didn't wait any longer, and we both just ran for our lives. Well, at least it felt like it. We didn't look back, and we just ran. We reached the first street lamp on the path, but it wasn't lit. I'm not sure if it was lit when we passed it the first time, but it was weird. Anyway, we just kept running, and when we got to the next lamp, it was lit. But we didn't stop. We ran and ran until we finally reached the road, and we just didn't stop moving. And as we walked away from the path that leads to the forest, we suddenly felt better, like way better, as if we had carried a rock on our back and we just dropped it. We were both scared at this time, and we only used the biggest and brightest roads until we arrived back at my place. And we didn't talk about it with anyone else until months later. My friend told me later that when he first heard that scream, he just kind of froze. Not like something or someone is physically or forcefully stopping him from moving. More like the body just said, "Nope, turn around." And honestly, I felt the same. We didn't even say anything like, "Huh?" or "What was that?" or anything. We were just silent until the moment we stopped running and started walking. After all these years, I've told this story a lot of times, and nobody could give me a satisfying explanation. People have showed me bird screams and sounds from other animals, machines, weather phenomena, foxes, and so on. But nothing was even close. Most people would just insist that it was an animal, though. But I can tell you that it wasn't. We've been in that small forest hundreds of times before, even at night, and never seen anything suspicious. But I can tell you that that night was the last time that I ever set foot into that nightmare made of trees. I was in the 5th grade when this all started, and let me first say, there are many events that happened from when I was in the 5th grade to about the 8th, but I'm only really going to talk about 2. So, it all began when someone knocked on the door. Back then, my neighborhood was considered to be pretty safe. We never locked our doors because we never really had a reason to. So, I went to the door and I opened it, but nobody was there. I honestly didn't think too much of it at the time. It was probably one of my brother's friends or something, so I turned on the porch light and went outside to look. Once again, for as far as I could see, there was no one there. I went back inside, a little bit confused, and sat down in the living room to watch House until my mum got home. Half an hour goes by and I'm still sitting on my couch, which overlooks my kitchen, the kitchen window, and partly out into my backyard. Though at this time it was like 8 p.m, so it was fairly dark. With my head facing the left side of the room watching my show, I saw something dark flash by the window. It was quick and it was only out of the corner of my eye, but there was definitely something that flashed by the window. A few more minutes go by and I'm texting my best friend Sam. I told her that I thought that someone might be trying to prank me or something when I started to just feel really uneasy, like someone was watching me. I looked up and I shit you not, there was the outline of a person, all in black, in the fucking window. I just sat there, paralyzed, staring at him, and he lightly knocked at the window and does one of those closed-fingered waves that you do to children before he just disappears. In my head, I was like, no fucking way that just happened. And even if it did, I was sure that it was just one of my brother's friends pranking me. But either way, I wasn't going to stay in that living room to just let them mess with me some more. I booked it up to my room and locked the door. My mum came home about 20 minutes later with my brother, Harrison. I asked my mum if she saw anyone out there, and my brother if he intentionally had someone mess with me, but they both told me no. Harrison really wasn't that kind of person anyway, to do something like that. But I figured with it being so close to Halloween, anything was possible. I just tried to put it out of my head, and that was that for now. Before I go on, here's some insight into what happened in between these two events. I'm fairly certain now that it wasn't my brother's friend, and to this day, I honestly don't know who it was, or what they really looked like. But after that day, I started noticing someone in the backyard. They would just be standing there with black shoes, black pants, a black hoodie pulled up, black gloves, and I was never able to see his face, so I assume a black mask too. Each time this happened, I would run and tell my mum, but by the time that she got there, they were always gone. I started getting phone calls too from an unknown number around that time, to just silence, and occasional breathing, but nobody ever said anything. It only happened a few times, probably less than 20, but they would happen at random times throughout the day and night, though mainly during the night. For a long time, I was the only one who ever physically saw any of this happening because it pretty much always happened when I was home alone, or really late at night. Until one day, my mum, my neighbour, and I were on the porch talking, when I asked him if he ever saw anybody lingering around our backyard. My mum was quickly like, Mila, because I guess she didn't want me to sound crazy to the neighbour, since I kept saying all this was happening and she never saw the guy. I mean, she picked up silent phones, but for some reason, she never really believed me about the guy in the backyard. But to my surprise, our neighbour, he told me that he did. He ended up telling my mum and I that he was sitting on his back porch, next to ours, with his girlfriend, when a man, all in black, came out from behind a tree. He started walking, and then running towards them. When my neighbour, who had a license to carry, pulled out his firearm and told the guy to stop running, the man apparently didn't stop. Matt, our neighbour, shot at the ground and the guy finally stopped. He turned around and just ran in the opposite direction, tripping over a branch and then getting up and disappearing. I felt so relieved, thinking that had to be the guy, and that surely now he'd never come back. But of course, that's not how it happened. Now, before I get back to it, let me explain. My mum didn't frequently leave me home alone. A lot of the time, I was left with my brother, who was 7 years older than me, or a family member. But there were a few times when my mum had work, or went shopping, or went out, and I would elect to stay on my own rather than tag along or go somewhere else. So, on this night, I was home alone once more. I was in the living room, and because things had sort of died down a bit with the man in the backyard, I felt comfortable enough to sit in my living room and watch some TV again. At this time, I can't remember what I was watching, but, like the first fucking time, something black flashed by the window. At this point, I was like, nah, this can't be happening again. And I didn't immediately want to call my mum and ruin her night if it turned out to be not a big deal. So I just stared intently at the window, just waiting for him to pop up like he did last time. During what felt like an eternity, and was probably only 5 minutes, I had muted my TV. There was an eerie silence, like in those action movies where they're like, it's quiet, too quiet. I mean, at that moment, I could have probably heard a pin drop. But instead, I began to hear my back door rattle slightly. My heart dropped and started racing, and it felt like it was going to leap out of my chest. They were trying to break down the door, and from where I was, whoever was at the back door couldn't see me. As I heard my door being broken into, my fight or flight response must have kicked in, and I grabbed my phone, unlocked my front door, and hauled ass across the street. I started bawling my eyes out as I ran down random side streets and alleyways to get as far away from my house as possible, and I ended up sitting under a lamplight, pretty much on the other side of town. I called my mum and her boyfriend, Kyle, but they could barely understand me as I was blabbering so much. When I was finally able to calm down, I explained to them what happened and where I was, and they immediately came and picked me up. In the car, I felt so much safer. Kyle was a really big guy, and he did construction and worked on houses. He had muscle, and he was a scary dude if you didn't know him. When we got home, Kyle went in first. He told us to stay in the car, and from inside the house he yelled out that the back door was wide open. He went room to room, floor to floor of our house, searched our backyard, shed, everything. But whoever it was, they were long gone. My mum later tried to comfort me and say that maybe it was our cat or something, but we both knew that it wasn't the cat. Our back door is pretty hard to get into, and that fucker was wide open. I saw the guy in our yard a few times after that, always just standing there in one spot, and I started sleeping with a knife secretly tucked away by my bed. But eventually, he just stopped coming around. It took a while, but he did, and luckily, nothing like that has ever happened again. I think it's also really important to add that nothing had been stolen from my house that night. There were no drawers open, and the door to my basement is right across from the back door. it's often kept open and it had some pretty expensive equipment down there, but it was never touched. So, because nothing from my house was taken, we didn't call the cops because, like I said, for a long time, my mum didn't believe me. And once she did, we had no evidence, and eventually it just all stopped anyway. To this day, I have no idea what that man wanted, or why he tried to break into my house. But my mind continues to come up with some ideas. I was only 10 or 11 years old at the time that it all started, and I was probably around 12 or 13 when he tried to break in. Both times, I was home alone. I'm almost 20 now, and although I don't really think about this too much anymore, I still always find myself watching the window and the back door of my house. Sometimes, I still get that eerie feeling when I'm home alone too. But I'm sure he's gone by now, long gone. Though, I don't think I'll ever be able to go in the backyard, alone. As far back as I can remember, about 2 or 3 years old, up to about 11 or 12, I would wake up located partially or completely under my bed. This would happen more than once per week on average. During my younger years, my parents would find me under my bed. But the strange part is that my beds were never far off the ground. My younger self, in a crib, would have to have belly crawled and squeezed under the bottom to get there. And my older self had a twin bed that took considerable effort to crawl out from under. Being naive at the time though, I figured I must have just fallen out of bed and rolled under. And I would pull myself out and just go back to sleep. But now I realize that rolling under these beds was not possible in any case. But here is the even stranger part. I now have a young daughter of my own, and when she was 3 or 4 years old, we had a hard time keeping her in bed. I would lay down on the floor next to her bed and wait for her to fall asleep. Most of the time, I would fall asleep first. One night, I woke up to her screaming. Her light was still on, and I had only been sleeping for about 10 minutes. But she told me that an old lady hand came out from under my bed and pulled on my hair. When I pressed her for more information, all she would tell me is that it looked old and bony. She also revealed, apparently, that this was not the first time she saw this happen. I don't know what to believe about all this, and it's really creeping me out. Has anyone else ever heard or seen anything similar? In 2013, I was a 21-year-old and studying abroad in South America with my college roommate. I had more than one unsettling encounter while down there, but I'm an experienced traveler and generally have good instincts. So I can't say I have any other thrilling stories aside from narrowly dodging a few muggings and such. Other than the general sense of unease that comes with being a solo female traveler. Well, a pair of solo female travelers to be exact. Our 4-month stay was relatively unexciting. Relatively. At the end of our program, we decided to stay for some extra time and do some more casual backpacking. We ended up deciding to hike the Inca Trail. It was amazing for anyone considering it. For the unfamiliar, you start in one location, which varies depending on the trek you choose, and then you end in a small town near Machu Picchu. Your return trip is covered by your hiking company, unless you choose to stay, in which case you get a refund. Well, we were in a new town and our company left immediately after lunch, and we wanted to spend the night and get the most out of being in that part of the country. The time came and we said farewell to 11 of our 12 hiking companions, and were joined by one other of our new friends, who was planning on starting an additional hike in the morning. Our guides gave us our refund and gave us very careful instructions on how to get back to Cusco, the city that we had originally departed from. They told us, when you're ready to leave, make your way to that train station right there. Don't go anywhere else. It's a very official and safe train. And once you get to the last stop, go to the official bus station and it'll bring you back to Cusco. We understood, thanked them and parted ways. That night, we went out drinking with the remaining member of our hiking party. He didn't drink because of his grueling hike the next day, but we had a blast and felt safer for having a male with us. Overall, we made sure to keep our wits about us, and it turns out to be a very fun night, without any incidents. We make our way back to the hostel, wish him well on his travels, and go to bed, ready to explore the town the next day before catching the train home. We have our fun, then make our way to the train station. It's actually a really nice train, not unlike the ones I take in the US occasionally, in fact, maybe even nicer. In other words, it definitely felt very safe. So, the train pulls into the station and we began trying to locate the bus station. We ask a gentleman who clearly works at that stop, and he points and tells us to walk about a half-mile that direction, and we wouldn't be able to miss it. We thank him and continue. I want to pause here, though, to emphasize, all of these conversations and the ones that follow, they're all entirely in Spanish. This isn't too important, but it's good for you to understand that I was speaking a language that I was extremely proficient in, but not fluent. It's not too difficult for native speakers to talk quickly and avoid being understood, if you get my drift. So, we walk for what actually does not seem like enough time, less than a half a mile for sure though, before coming across a bus station. I'm shocked, to say the least, but I'm also reminding myself that I came from a much nicer part of the world, and I need to put aside my preconceived notions. It has a sign clearly labeling it the bus station, and it says to Cusco right on the sign. To be clear, it's not a fake sign. It's similar to a sign marking a gas station from a freeway. A big thick pole, and the actual sign was probably 50 feet in the air. It could not have been a temporary trick, in other words. Otherwise, I would have been much more suspicious. Aside from that sign, though, well, it was something alright. The buses were all the classic bad news white van. You know the ones. Again, though, I checked myself. How many people could possibly travel to Cusco in a day here? It wouldn't make sense to have a giant 20-plus seater bus doing the trek every day. There's also a tiny wooden building, presumably an office, underneath the big sign. But we didn't need to go in there, as there are two gentlemen standing outside near the vans. We asked them if these are the buses to Cusco, though we can clearly read on the sign that they are. And the men, they confirm it. We ask how much the tickets cost and when they plan on departing. They give us the price and say 5 to 10 minutes, and then direct us to a van to sit and wait in. We both sit down, and I'll admit it, I was uneasy. Again, I'm an experienced traveler, and I do know not to expect modern luxuries in the less developed parts of the world, and there's nothing outwardly sinister about this bus stop, but it just wasn't what I was expecting, even for the area. My roommate does not seem to be sharing any of my trepidation. However, she's a bit more sheltered and generally trusting, so that's fairly in her character for her. I'm also an over-worrier, so between us, we were probably both on the more extreme side of the appropriate emotion. Me silently freaking out and her a little too relaxed. Anyway, we wait for over 10 minutes in this van, which we've left the door open due to the heat. We're just talking and swatting flies, which are buzzing in and out of the open door. I'm unsurprised that we're not on schedule, as I know they're trying to avoid wasting a tank of gas on 2 passengers and trying to wait for more people. But we do have an hour's drive ahead of us, and I do want to get going, so I decided to go and ask. They tell us 5 more minutes. Sure. More time passes though, and I just can't shake the feeling that we aren't at the right bus station. Though nobody made mention of there being more than one in a tiny town. So I just kept telling myself that I was being irrational. I decided to go and see if anybody is in the office and just get some more information though. I open the door and walk in without much hesitation, given its positioning under the giant sign. Well, I walk into what is clearly a residence, and like 15 Peruvians cooking beans and looking as shocked to see me as I am to see them. I stammer out, is this the bus station? They look confused and then go, "Oh, the bus? Yes, the bus. Yeah, go outside and talk to the men. Bus to Cusco." I back out and apologize for intruding. I go back to the van to report the experience to my roommate, right as another girl walks up and says, "Bus to Cusco." She clearly is a native Spanish speaker and not a foreign tourist. The men immediately say yes and place her in a different van, which makes no sense if they're trying to fill one van to take us to the same place. This skeeves me out more than anything else that's happened yet. I put my head in the van and tell my roommate to keep hanging tight. I walk over to the girl in the other van, where she's also waiting alone, and ask her if she's going to Cusco. She confirms this to be the case, and I explain that we're going there as well, and I'm not sure why we've been put in separate vans. She says that she doesn't know either, but looks generally unconcerned. So I just go back to our van and sit down. I go back and sit in the van, which my roommate has not left, and we've been there for probably near 30 to 40 minutes at this point. I start expressing my concerns to her, but she's being somewhat dismissive, which, honestly, I can't blame her for, as I'm a generally anxious person and she's more used to that than anyone. We get pretty quiet and resign ourselves to waiting, still swatting flies and dabbing our brows with our shirts. I'm now sitting quietly with my mind going wild with possibilities, and extremely suspicious that something is wrong, but also conceding that there's nothing too concrete justifying my level of concern. At this point, I'm now picturing some ploy to abduct foreigners, or being generally murdered, and it's not a good feeling. The flies are driving me absolutely mad at this point, and now I've decided they're probably hovering around the car because somebody was murdered in there, and the blood wasn't cleaned well enough to fool the flies. At this point, I'm just torturing myself. The train of thought continues though, and I look up, and there's hundreds of flies swarmed and crawling on the roof of the van. I realized we hadn't noticed because only a few would be flying around at that time, and the van was rather spacious, and my roommate and we were closer to the front while the mass grouping of them was closer to the back. Honestly, I'm frozen in fear at this point, unsure if this is confirming my theory that somebody was murdered in this car, or if I'm really letting my imagination run wild and there are less remarkable things than flies in a South American van. I'm basically hyperventilating now, and I wish I could emphasize just how many flies were in there. I gesture upwards to my roommate, who looks up there and then appears shocked. At this point, I can assume I'm shaking my head and muttering, and right as this happens, the other van with the native girl begins to pull away. I make a snap decision and I launch myself out of their van and start sprinting and slam my hand on her van to bring it to a stop. She opens the door in shock and I grab the door to hold it open and say more forcefully than I thought I had in me, "Listen, we're coming with you." I look back at my roommate, who is just staring, and I yell, "Grab your bags and run, now." She knew better than to mess with me when I'm in crisis mode, and comes sprinting out of the other van with both backpacks in hand while I keep my hand on the door. The two men come running after her, saying, "Don't go, we leave now, we leave for Cusco now," as I shove my friend into the car and scream, "Sorry, we're riding with our friend here," and slam the door closed. The native girl, looking unsettled, just tells the driver that we are her friends and to drive. At this point, I don't know that this driver isn't in on whatever I was afraid of, or if he was, but they didn't plan on messing with a local or something. Either way, I just saw her as our best bet. We pull out onto the road and drive for a few minutes when I see, and you guessed it, the bus station. A very official, legitimate-looking bus station, with actual buses, which was probably about a half a mile from the train. I have no doubt that this is where we were supposed to go, and feel the blood drain from my face. I thought about jumping out of the van and running, but in a split second, I questioned if it wasn't for official tour groups or anything else I may not be considering. And my worst fear is ending up back at the first place with our new local friend. As we drive, I'm looking for street signs, landmarks, or anything to indicate that we're actually headed to Cusco. All I see is wide open desert plains and nothing else. I sat the rest of the drive frozen in fear, collecting a pile of makeshift weapons from what I could find in the back of the van. This included a sharp piece of car, likely from some previous collision, and a smallish fire extinguisher. I told myself that if anybody tried to hurt us, I would kill them first and then figure out how to avoid a Peruvian prison second. I spent the entire car ride just telling myself that I had it in me to kill a person if they tried to harm me. I gripped my weapons until my knuckles turned white, when suddenly the van came to a stop, very much in the middle of nowhere. The driver accepts a phone call, which I can't understand. He gets off the phone and slowly tells us that he just remembered that he can't take us all the way to Cusco. The native girl looks concerned, which makes me even more paranoid, and he proceeds to point to a large but desolate building and tells us to go in there to find a ride the rest of the way. Looking back, I'm not sure how I avoided throwing up from anxiety and fear at this point. So, the three of us journey in there, my weapons abandoned as I couldn't sneak them out of the van, and people just keep pointing us further and further back until we come to a back opening leading us outside. I wanted to run, to somehow undo this entire journey, but we really had no other choice than to stick with this native girl. I mean, we had no alternative methods of transportation. There's no civilization in sight, and honestly, I'm not even sure what part of the country we're in. All I know is that we're 60 to 90 minutes away from wherever the train stopped, hopefully in the direction of Cusco. We eventually get to another van, this time with the opposite problem. They're insisting that we fit 10 plus people into a 7-seater van. They try to take my backpack, saying that it needs to be on the roof. That backpack had my passport and every resource I would most certainly want in an emergency, so I'm thinking that they can take it over my dead body, which might very well be happening at this point. And this all happens right as I see my roommate happily passing hers to the lady. I grab her arm angrily and ready to ask what on earth is wrong with her survival instincts, but my face must have said it all because she backs up and uncertainly tells the lady, never mind, she'll be keeping her bag with her. The lady looks aggravated and says that they won't fit in the car with all the people, and I tell her that we're happy to hold them as I climb in and demonstrate in a way that will require her to force either me or the bag out. she eventually relents and my roommate crawls in too. We sit in the back with our backpacks towering on our laps in front of us, and my roommate looking somewhat inconvenienced that I've made her do this. Honestly, maybe I was overreacting, but better that than underreacting, right? We drive a long while, and finally, we enter the city borders of Cusco. On the one hand, I'm relieved because I now know exactly where we are. On the other hand, the surrounding areas outside of the main square are extremely dangerous shanty towns, and we are the only foreigners with giant backpacks on the bus. No sooner am I thinking, well, at least we're close, when the bus driver turns and says that he doesn't want to drive further, and we can figure our own way from there. Even the native girl immediately goes on red alert and offers to pay more if he'll take us to the city square. He declines though, kicks us out of the bus and drives away. We are looking at all the people staring openly at us, and she asks us in a scared voice if we'll split a cab with her, and we agree immediately. The problem is, in this part of the world, a cab is often the first car to drive up, and assures you that they'll take you to where you're going. It's not very official at all. And this is exactly what happens. A Corolla from, I'm sure was 1993, pulls up and tells us to hop in. Our friend looks wary, but decides it's better than winging it out here in the open. He drops us in the town square, without incident. And at this point, the native girl looks like she's aged 5 years since we first crossed paths with her hours ago, and I'm sure I looked even worse. She meekly says, "Well, I'm glad we got here safely." I can barely talk, I'm so exhausted to be honest, and respond, "Me too, thanks." And just like that, we part our ways. I had a few incidences on this trip that made me a believer that no matter where you are, one traumatic experience makes wherever the last place you slept feel like home. And let me tell you, the hostel bed, it felt just like home that night.